James hummed to himself as he tied the last golden ribbon onto the chandelier, glancing around the room with satisfaction. The living room was warm and cozy, bathed in soft candlelight, each flicker casting a gentle glow over the anniversary decorations he had spent hours perfecting. The scent of Destiny's favorite dishes wafted from the kitchen, creamy pasta, garlic bread, and her beloved chocolate fondue cooling on the counter, ready for dessert. "Just one more touch," he murmured, lighting the final candle in the centerpiece. He stepped back, admiring his work, a sense of joy filling him as he imagined Destiny's expression when she saw the effort he'd put in. 25 years together. 25 years of memories, children, and shared dreams. Tonight, he wanted to remind her of the love they had built. A faint voice from down the hall caught his attention. It was Destiny's voice, low and almost conspiratorial, seeping through the thin walls of the guest room. Curious, he wandered closer, thinking she might be planning her own surprise. But then he recognized their son Leon's voice, a mixture of surprise and worry. His feet froze in place when he caught her words. "The paternity test came back," Destiny was saying, her voice matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing a grocery list. "None of you four are your dad's children." James felt his throat tighten, and he pressed a hand to the wall to steady himself. His brain scrambled to make sense of what he was hearing. He must have misheard, surely. But then she continued, her tone completely casual. "Once he pays off the mortgage and covers your college fees, we'll tell him at your graduation," she said, almost laughing. "After that, I'll take the house and assets in the divorce. We'll be free." James's hands clenched into fists. The words rattled through him like shards of broken glass. His mind screamed to burst through the door, demand an explanation, but his body held back. Years of love, trust, and everything they'd built together. He'd been standing on quicksand without even realizing it. He forced himself to breathe. She was still talking, but he couldn't hear anything beyond the steady thrum of blood pounding in his ears. In that moment, his whole world shattered around him. His gaze drifted back to the living room, balloons, candles, her favorite dishes, all the little details he'd fussed over for days. It felt like some twisted joke, like he was an extra in a play he hadn't signed up for. He knew he had to act like he hadn't heard anything. With a forced calmness, he turned back to the living room and sat down on the couch, replaying her words over and over in his head. It took every ounce of his willpower to stay seated and breathe deeply, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. A few minutes later, he heard footsteps coming from the hallway. Destiny entered, her face lighting up as she looked around the decorated room. "James," she exclaimed, covering her mouth with a smile. "Oh my God, you really went all out." He forced himself to smile. "Only the best for our 25 years together," he replied, his voice smooth and steady. Years of pretending to be strong for his family had given him that talent. "You like it?" "I love it," she said, moving forward to embrace him, pressing a kiss to his cheek. The kiss felt like ice on his skin, but he pulled her closer because he needed to hold her and remember what it used to feel like. He needed to feel the betrayal fully, like some kind of confirmation that it was real. They ate dinner in near silence, James barely tasting the food. Destiny's gaze occasionally drifted to him with concern. "You okay?" she asked, smiling. "You seem a little distracted." "Just thinking about everything," he replied, raising his glass to her. "To us, Destiny. To 25 years. She beamed, clinking her glass with his. "To 10 more? Her eyes sparkled, oblivious to the storm brewing behind his calm facade. After dinner, she helped him clear the plates, making small talk about their plans for the next day. "Oh, Leon's graduation is just around the corner," she said with excitement. "It'll be such a big day for him." James smiled, though every mention of his son felt like another needle jabbed into his heart. "It will," he replied, folding a napkin. "I'm so proud of him." When the cleanup was done, James sat back on the couch, his gaze settling on Destiny as she chatted about the plans she had for Leon's graduation, oblivious to the silent storm raging inside him. "Maybe we could get him something special for his graduation," she suggested, tilting her head thoughtfully. James gave a slow nod. "Something memorable, yes," he murmured, though his mind was already elsewhere, planning a different kind of surprise. Destiny smiled, oblivious to the double meaning behind his words. "That's a wonderful idea, James. You've always been so thoughtful." He forced a smile and took her hand. For a brief second, he studied her face, trying to see if he could find any hint of the woman he'd thought he knew. The woman who had been his partner, the mother of his children, or at least the children he'd thought were his. But she looked back at him with nothing but a calm, innocent gaze, as though nothing were amiss. It was chilling. As they moved to the living room, Destiny poured them both a glass of wine, settling onto the couch beside him. She leaned her head against his shoulder, letting out a contented sigh. "We've built a good life together, haven't we?" she said softly. The irony was almost too much to bear. He gripped his glass tightly, feeling the weight of her head on his shoulder like a heavy burden. He forced his voice to remain steady. "Yes," he said, barely able to get the word out. "We have." He could feel her smile. "I'm lucky to have you, James," she whispered, her hand finding his. "Not every woman gets this kind of love. You know that." He looked down at their interlocked fingers, while rising in his throat as he thought of the secret she was holding, the plan she had so confidently shared just moments before. "You're right," he said quietly, swallowing the anger that threatened to surface. "Not every woman." They sat in silence, the candles flickering around them. To an outsider, they would have looked like any happy couple celebrating a milestone in their marriage. But inside, James was already planning his escape, knowing that tonight would be the last time he would sit like this beside her. The weight of what he knew was too much to keep hidden, and he could already feel his resolve hardening into something fierce and unbreakable. As the evening drew to a close, Destiny finally rose, stretching her arms with a yawn. "I'll clean up tomorrow." "It's been a wonderful night, James." "Thank you." He nodded, watching her closely. "You're welcome," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She moved to kiss him goodnight, but he turned his head, letting her lips brush against his cheek. She gave him a puzzled look, but he just shrugged, pretending to be tired. She didn't press further, just gave a small nod and headed upstairs. When he heard her footsteps recede, James stayed seated, staring blankly at the table and the decorations he had spent hours arranging. It all felt so absurd now, as if he had decorated for a stranger's anniversary. He downed the rest of his wine, the bitterness in his mouth matching the bitterness in his heart. Rising from the couch, he took one last look around the room. The candles had started to burn low, casting long shadows across the walls, making the room feel like a stage after the final act. A place where the actors had exited, and only silence remained. With a deep breath, he moved to the kitchen counter and took out his phone. He had thought about hiring a private investigator, about gathering evidence and fighting for his assets in court. But after hearing what she'd said, after everything he'd heard, he knew he wanted nothing from her. He didn't want to fight her in court or battle for what was his. He wanted to leave everything behind, to free himself from this world of lies. By the time dawn broke over the horizon, the house was silent and empty. The candles had long since burned out, leaving nothing but melted wax on the table, a fitting metaphor for the life he'd left behind. As he walked out the door for the last time, he looked back at the house, a sense of closure settling over him. This was the end, but it was also the beginning of something new. That night, James barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his children's faces, each one so full of life and energy, each one he'd loved with everything he had. Now, every time he looked at them, he felt the weight of the truth bearing down on him. They weren't his, not by blood, but that didn't matter. He knew he still loved them. Yet his life with Destiny was over. The next morning, he acted as if everything was normal. He made breakfast, chatted about Leon's latest football game, and asked his youngest, Callie, how school was going. She grinned up at him, syrup smeared on her face. "Daddy, can we go to the zoo this weekend?" she asked, her little hands waving around in excitement. "Maybe, sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile. "I'll see what I can do." Later, as he was clearing the dishes, Leon came over to help. "Dad, thanks for the help with my tuition," he said quietly. "I know it's a lot, but it means everything to me." James's throat tightened. He wanted to tell Leon that it didn't matter what the test said, that he was still his son. But he simply nodded and clapped Leon on the shoulder. You just focus on making us proud, son. I'll handle the rest. Over the next few weeks, James began his preparations. He spent late nights quietly moving funds, careful to leave no trace that Destiny would notice until he was gone. He knew she was watching, biding her time for the right moment to reveal her plan. She probably thought he had no idea, that he was clueless, blindly in love. But he was far from blind now. He set up a trust for each child, ensuring that when they needed it, they'd have access to the funds. He even wrote letters to each of them, trying to explain as best he could why he was leaving. He kept the letters brief, knowing they'd never fully explain everything. But maybe someday, they'd understand that he was doing this for their future. One night, as he was wrapping up his final preparations, Destiny walked into the room, catching him off guard. "Hey," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "You've been working late a lot lately. Everything okay?" "Yeah," he replied, keeping his tone casual. "Just trying to get everything sorted before the end of the quarter." She shrugged, giving him a smile that seemed genuine. "All right, well, don't work too hard. You know the kids miss you when you're locked up in here all night." A bitter laugh almost escaped him, but he swallowed it down. Instead, he simply nodded. "I know. I'll be done soon." Finally, on a quiet Sunday evening, he knew it was time. The house was still, and everyone had gone to bed. James sat at the kitchen table, staring at the blank piece of paper in front of him. After a long pause, he picked up his pen and began to write. "Destiny, I'm not the man you thought I was, but you certainly aren't the woman I thought I knew. This house, my love, my family, they were all built on lies. I hope you find what you're looking for, but it won't be at my expense. Goodbye, Destiny." He folded the letter carefully and set it on the kitchen counter, next to the paternity results. For a long moment, he simply stood there, looking at the letter and the life he was about to leave behind. It felt surreal, like he was stepping out of his own skin. He checked his watch. It was close to midnight. Quietly, he moved through the darkened house, stepping into each child's room one by one. In Callie's room, he knelt by her bed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She murmured something in her sleep and turned over, her small hand clutching his. "Goodbye, baby girl," he whispered, kissing her forehead. "Be strong, all right?" He moved to Leon's room, watching his oldest sleep. Leon had always looked up to him, and James could still remember when Leon had asked if he'd grow up to be like him one day. He felt a pang of regret, wondering what Leon would think when he found out the truth about his departure. In each room, he left a piece of himself, saying goodbye to the life he'd known. By the time he was done, he felt empty, like he'd left a piece of his soul in that house. As he reached the front door, he turned back one last time, staring at the home he'd built, the memories he'd made, and the family he believed in. With a deep breath, he turned the doorknob and stepped outside, closing the door quietly behind him. The cool night air hit him, a stark reminder of the finality of his choice. It had been 3 years since James had walked out of his life, leaving behind the pain, betrayal, and a house filled with memories. In that time, he'd crafted a new life, simple and quiet, in a remote mountain cabin surrounded by trees, far away from the world he once knew. He worked odd jobs for nearby towns, kept to himself, and every now and then, he'd stare at the distant peaks, wondering how the people he left behind were faring. The ache of missing his children never went away, but he'd learned to live with it, just as he'd learned to live with the betrayal. One afternoon, while he was chopping wood outside, he heard the sound of a car approaching. His heart skipped a beat, rare in these parts, and he watched as an old sedan crept up the gravel drive. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped Leon, his eldest. James froze, the axe slipping from his hand and lodging itself in the dirt. Leon's face was thin, his eyes shadowed, a weary look in his gaze that hadn't been there before. For a moment, neither of them moved, both unsure of how to break the silence. Then Leon cleared his throat. "Dad, I found you." His voice was shaky, uncertain. "Please, just listen to me." James's heart pounded. The urge to run over and embrace his son was nearly overwhelming, but he held himself back. He'd spent 3 years coming to terms with the truth, convincing himself that he'd left for the right reasons. Seeing Leon here, standing in front of him, threw all of that into question. "Leon," he said, voice low, cautious. "What are you doing here?" Leon took a hesitant step forward, hands stuffed in his pockets. I needed to see you. Mom, things have been a mess. She lost the house, and things with us, they're not good." James nodded, trying to ignore the pang of guilt that hit him. He had known the fallout would be messy, but he'd imagined that he was sparing them all from an even greater pain. He had hoped they'd be better off without the lies. Leon continued, his voice growing steadier. "We try to manage, but Mom, she's changed. Everything changed after you left, and none of us knew why. She only told us bits and pieces." A sharp breath escaped James as he gestured toward the small porch of his cabin. "You want to come inside?" he offered. Leon nodded, following his father into the modest cabin. Inside, it was simple but cozy, a wood-burning stove in the corner, a small kitchen with a single plate drying on the counter. James motioned to the worn couch, and Leon sat, looking around as if trying to piece together what kind of life his father had built. James took a seat across from him. "Tell me what happened, Leon," he said quietly. Leon ran a hand through his hair, eyes staring down at his hands. "Mom, she told us the truth after you left. About how you weren't our real dad." He swallowed hard, his voice breaking. "But that didn't change anything for me. You were my dad. You raised us, taught us everything we know. And then, one day, you were just gone. No note, no reason. Just gone." James felt his throat tighten. "I thought you would all be better off without me after what I heard. I thought I was sparing you, sparing us." Leon's voice cracked, filled with a mix of anger and sadness. "Dad, you were everything to us. We didn't care about a test or biology or any of that. You were the one who was there every single day. We needed you, and you just disappeared." James looked away, guilt creeping in. "Leon, I thought leaving was the only way. You don't know what it's like to hear the person you love say that your whole life together is a lie." Leon shook his head. "Maybe I don't, but I do know what it's like to lose the only father I ever had without an explanation. I know what it's like to watch Mom fall apart and not be able to fix it. And now I'm here, asking you to come back. Please." The words hung heavy in the air. James sat silently, wrestling with emotions he'd kept buried for years. He had convinced himself that leaving had been the only choice. But hearing Leon's words, seeing the pain in his eyes, James wondered if he'd made a mistake. "Your mother, she didn't tell you why I left?" he asked cautiously. Leon's gaze hardened. "She said it was complicated, that you found out about the paternity tests and couldn't handle it. But she wouldn't tell us anything else." James clenched his fists. "It wasn't just the tests, Leon. I overheard her saying things, making plans, talking about taking everything once I'd paid for the house in your college. I realized she never loved me. I was just convenient." Leon's face fell, and he looked away, the weight of the revelation hitting him. "Dad, I don't know what happened between you two, but we needed you there. Callie, she struggled the most. She barely talks to anyone anymore. She still sets a place for you at the table some nights." A tear slipped down James's face, and he quickly wiped it away. "I thought I was doing what was best. I wanted to leave something behind for you all, something good. Maybe you did, but it's not enough, Dad." Leon's voice was raw, pleading. "I know things can't go back to the way they were. I know Mom messed things up, and I can't change what she did. But I don't want to lose you two." James took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his choices, the distance he tried to put between himself and the pain. Yet here was his son, his real son, pleading for him to come back, to fill the void he had left behind. "What do you want from me, Leon?" he asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Leon's eyes met his, filled with a desperate hope. "I want you to come back with me. I want you to be part of our lives again. Even if you don't want to see Mom, that's okay. But we need you, Dad. Callie, Alan, Sophie. They all need you." James stared at his son, the love he had tried to bury rising to the surface, undeniable. He thought of the kids, of the home he had left, and the family he had tried to forget. For so long, he convinced himself that his absence would help them heal. But maybe he'd been wrong. After a long pause, James said, "All right, I'll come back, Leon. I'll help you understand what happened and maybe help all of you heal from this." He looked at Leon directly, his gaze firm. "But understand this. I can't go back to the way things were. I don't think I'll ever be able to forgive Destiny." Leon nodded. "I get that, Dad. None of us expect you to. But we need you. Not as a husband to Mom, but as our dad." James took a steadying breath, feeling the weight of his decision settle. "I can be that for you. I can be there for you, for Callie, Alan, and Sophie. But it's going to take time. For all of us." Leon gave a faint smile, a glimmer of hope finally breaking through the cloud of pain. "Thank you, Dad. That's all we want." James stood, his heart pounding, but for the first time in years, it was filled with purpose. "All right, Leon, we'll go back, but we're doing this together." In that moment, he felt the beginnings of a new chapter unfold, one built on truth, healing, and maybe, just maybe, a second chance at family. A relieved smile broke across Leon's face, and without another word, he reached over, pulling his father into a tight embrace. James felt the years of separation melt away, the bitterness and hurt replaced by a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, James felt something close to peace. James walked up the familiar path to his old home, Leon by his side. He could feel Leon's tension, but he didn't say anything, hoping his presence would be enough. The house loomed, as worn and empty as he felt 3 years ago when he walked away. The garden was unkempt, weeds covering the flower beds where he and Destiny had once planted tulips together. The front door creaked as they entered, the air stale. Destiny stood in the hallway, as if she'd sensed his approach. She was thinner than he remembered, her once stylish clothes now worn and wrinkled, hair unkempt and eyes red-rimmed. "James," she whispered, her voice wavering, a fragile mix of disbelief and desperation. Her hands trembled as she reached out, moving forward as if she could pull him back into her life. "You came back. I thought I'd never see you again." James held her gaze, but there was no warmth in his eyes. He stayed rooted, his face unreadable. "I didn't come back for you, Destiny. I'm here for them," he said, gesturing toward Leon, who lingered in the doorway, and the faint sounds of footsteps above as his younger children peeked over the banister. Destiny's face fell. Her lips quivered, and her shoulders slumped as she seemed to realize this was no reunion. She took a tentative step closer, her voice cracking as she spoke. "I know I hurt you, James. I know I messed up, but I'm so sorry. I've paid for it, every day, in every way." "Paid for it?" James scoffed, the bitterness finally bubbling to the surface. "No, Destiny. You don't understand what paying for it means. You lied to me, to our children. You destroyed the life we had. And for what? For a lie you thought you could keep hidden?" Her face twisted in pain as she reached out, as if she could somehow touch the past and smooth it over. "I was wrong, James. I see that now. I've been punished enough." "Punished?" James's voice was low, steady, each word sharp as a knife. "Your punishment isn't over, Destiny. Not by a long shot. I was broken. I lost everything I thought was real. And it wasn't just me you hurt. Look at them." He gestured towards their children, who had silently crept closer, drawn by the tension. "They're the ones who suffered the most." Destiny turned to the children, her face stricken as her gaze met each one. Callie, the youngest, clung to the banister, her big eyes filled with uncertainty. Alan's face was hardened, filled with anger and resentment. Sophie looked down, unable to meet her mother's eyes. Leon's expression was guarded, but his stance told James that he wasn't here to protect Destiny, but to support his father. "I love them," Destiny insisted, turning back to James, a note of desperation in her voice. "I try to make it right. I never wanted them to suffer. I just made a mistake. A mistake." James's voice was cold, piercing. "This was no mistake, Destiny. This was a choice. You knew what you were doing. You had everything, and you threw it away for what? A moment of selfishness? You thought you could manipulate us all, use us, and we'd just forgive you." Tears streaked down her face, her hands reaching out in a silent plea. Please, James. I was scared. I didn't think it through. I didn't know how much it would cost. Can't you give me another chance? James shook his head, stepping back as she tried to touch his arm. It's too late, Destiny. The life we had, the family I thought we built, it's gone. You destroyed it, and you don't get to ask for another chance. I'm here to make things right for them, not for you. Destiny's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, clutching at his legs, her face a picture of raw desperation. I'm begging you, James. Please. I've lost everything. I'll do anything. Just don't leave us again. He looked down, unmoved by her display. I'm not leaving them, Destiny. But I'm leaving you. He stepped back, forcing her to release her grip, her hands falling limply to her sides as she stared up at him, her face stricken with despair. He turned to his children, meeting each of their eyes in turn. I know things have been hard. I know you've been through more than you should have, and I'm sorry for that. His voice softened as he continued. But I'm here now, and I'm giving each of you a choice. You can stay here, or you can come with me. We can start over, build something real based on truth. But it's your decision. Callie, wide-eyed and unsure, looked between her mother and father. She was young, barely able to understand the complexities of what had happened, but she saw the pain in her father's eyes, and it was enough. Dad, she whispered, stepping forward and grabbing his hand. I want to go with you. James's heart swelled, and he knelt down to meet her eye level. Then you'll come with me, he said softly, squeezing her hand gently. Alan crossed his arms, his face defiant as he looked at his mother. You lied to us. You let us think Dad abandoned us. You made us believe we couldn't trust him, he accused, his voice trembling with anger. I'm going with Dad. I'm done with all these lies. Sophie, her shoulders hunched, looked at her mother with sorrow, but also with a resignation that went beyond her years. I can't stay here either, Mom. You never told us the truth. I'll go with Dad. Leon moved to stand beside his siblings, his expression serious. We're a family, and family should be honest, even when it's hard. You chose lies over us. I'm with Dad. Destiny's face crumbled as she looked at each of them, her eyes filled with disbelief. You're all leaving me? Just like that? She whispered, her voice broken. You left us a long time ago, Mom, Alan said quietly. We're just finally accepting it. James watched as Destiny's expression shifted from disbelief to a hollow acceptance. She had lost them, and she knew it. Standing with his children by his side, James felt a strange peace. It wasn't triumph. There was no victory in tearing apart a life he had once cherished. But there was clarity, a sense of purpose in finally confronting the truth and moving forward. He turned to his children, his voice steady. Pack what you need. We're leaving tonight. As they went to gather their things, Destiny watched, a shadow of her former self, frozen in the doorway. James met her gaze one last time. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, Destiny, but it won't be at our expense anymore. And with that, he turned away, guiding his children toward a new life, leaving behind the wreckage of lies and betrayal. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was a chance to rebuild something true for himself and for the children who had chosen him in the end. James sat on the porch of his modest new home, the warm evening breeze stirring the trees surrounding the yard. It had been only a few months since he and his children had left the life they'd known, but in some ways, it felt like a lifetime ago. For the first time in years, he felt at peace, though he knew he still had work to do to rebuild the lives he'd once seen crumble before his eyes. The sound of laughter drifted from inside. Callie and Sophie were in the kitchen, trying their hand at making dinner, each of them giggling as they experimented with ingredients. Alan and Leon were outside, kicking a soccer ball back and forth, their easy banter filling the yard. He had dreamed of this, of quiet evenings with his children, free from tension and deception, and now it was finally real. A few months after their move, James had met Dorothy at a community event for new families in the area. She was different from anyone he'd known, kind-hearted, but with a resilience that intrigued him. She had her own history, carrying the kind of quiet strength that comes from weathering storms. When they talked, it felt natural, like meeting an old friend he hadn't seen in years. And though he hadn't thought he'd be ready to open up to anyone, something about Dorothy made him want to try. One evening, as they were packing up after a local fundraiser, Dorothy noticed him lost in thought and offered a gentle smile. "You look a million miles away, James," she said, her tone soft. He gave a small laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I guess I am. Just thinking about how different everything is now." Dorothy nodded, her gaze warm and understanding. Sometimes change is the hardest thing to accept, especially when it feels like you're leaving so much behind. James looked down, then back at her, surprised at how her words struck a chord. "I've been carrying a lot of baggage for a long time. I didn't think I'd ever be able to set it down." He paused, feeling the vulnerability creep in, but Dorothy's steady gaze gave him the courage to continue. "But these past few months, I think I'm finally ready to let go." She reached out, her hand resting briefly on his arm. "Then let go," she said simply. "You're allowed to start again. We all are." That moment sparked something between them, a connection that felt deeper than words. Over the next few weeks, they met often, sometimes by coincidence at local events, other times intentionally, a quiet invitation from one to the other. One weekend, Dorothy invited James and the kids over for a picnic by the river that ran along the edge of town. She brought a basket filled with sandwiches, fruit, and homemade cookies. James watched her interact with his children, amazed at how easily she won them over. Callie and Sophie sat beside her, peppering her with questions about her baking secrets, while Alan and Leon exchanged stories with her about their adventures in town. At one point, Leon nudged his father, a sly grin on his face. "Dad, she's pretty cool," he whispered, his eyes darting toward Dorothy. "Maybe you should keep her around." James chuckled, ruffling Leon's hair. "I'll keep that in mind, buddy." Later, as the sun began to set, James and Dorothy sat side by side on a blanket, watching the kids skip rocks across the water. She glanced at him, her expression gentle but curious. "You know, I see a different side of you around them," she said. "The way you care for them, the way you're rebuilding your life for them. It's inspiring." He shrugged, feeling a bit shy under her praise. "I'm just trying to give them a stable life. They've been through more than they ever should have." Dorothy nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "But that's what makes you a good father, James. You took a painful situation and made it into a fresh start for them. They're lucky to have you." He looked at her, the sincerity in her voice stirring something in him he hadn't felt in years. "Thank you, Dorothy. That means a lot." In the weeks that followed, Dorothy became a fixture in their lives. She was patient, never pushing him to rush things, allowing their bond to grow at its own pace. And gradually, she helped him open up in ways he hadn't thought possible. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, James and Dorothy sat on his porch, a warm cup of tea in each of their hands. The stars were bright above them, casting a peaceful glow over the town. Dorothy looked over at him, her gaze steady, and spoke gently. "You know, James, I think you've come a long way since the day we met. I see it in how you laugh now, how you're present with the kids. You've come back to life." James took a deep breath, her words resonating within him. "For a long time, I thought trust was impossible, that it was something other people could afford, but not me." He looked down, then back at her. "But you've shown me that it's worth trying again. You've given me hope, Dorothy." She smiled, reaching out to take his hand. "And you've given me hope too, James. I never thought I'd meet someone who could understand me so deeply." Her voice softened. "I care about you and the kids. I'm here for the long haul, if that's what you want." James felt his heart swell, a sense of warmth and relief flooding him. He squeezed her hand, a silent affirmation of everything he couldn't yet put into words. They sat there in silence, holding hands, as the night wrapped around them in a comforting embrace. For the first time in years, James allowed himself to think about the future without fear or bitterness. It wasn't perfect. There were still scars, still moments when he looked back and felt a pang of hurt. But he was learning that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but accepting it as part of his journey. One evening, as they gathered around the dinner table, Callie spoke up, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Dad, does this mean we're going to stay here forever?" James glanced at Dorothy, who gave him an encouraging nod, then looked back at Callie and the other kids. "Well," he said, his voice warm, "we've found a place we can be happy. We got friends here, a new family, and I think we can make this our forever home, if that's what you all want." The kids cheered, their faces lighting up with excitement. Alan looked at him, a rare smile on his face. Then it settled. "We're here to stay." As James watched his children embrace their new life and felt Dorothy's hand in his, he realized that he'd done something he hadn't thought possible. He had found love and trust again. He had built a new beginning, not only for himself but for his children, a life free of secrets and full of promise. In that moment, with laughter filling the room and the warmth of family surrounding him, James knew that he had finally, truly, found peace. Destiny sat alone in a cramped, dimly lit apartment. The walls were bare, and the only decorations were faded photographs, ghostly reminders of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. She clutched a picture frame, her fingers trembling as they traced over the smiling faces of her children. They had been young, full of laughter and innocence. James was in the photo, too, his arm wrapped around her, looking at her like she was his whole world. That look, she hadn't seen it in years, and now it haunted her. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. Regret washed over her like a wave. She had once been the woman he cherished, the woman who had everything, a loving husband, a beautiful home, for children who adored her. But now, those things were distant, intangible, and she was left with only memories. She had gambled it all, banking on a future that never came. With a bitter laugh, she remembered her old lover. He had promised her excitement, whispered dreams of a life far grander than what she had with James. But after James disappeared, so had he. It didn't take long for her lover's charm to wear thin, his patience fraying as he realized the inheritance and security she had promised him were now out of reach. Eventually, he left too, leaving her alone to face the consequences of her choices. One afternoon, while Destiny was walking down the street, she saw a family crossing on the opposite sidewalk. The father held his son's hand, while the mother carried a giggling toddler on her shoulders. They reminded her of her own family in a way that made her heart ache. She reached out to them instinctively, as if she could grasp that happiness again. But they disappeared around the corner, leaving her to stare at the empty space they left behind. A cough racked her body, breaking her from the trance. She'd been getting sick more often, something she had tried to ignore but could no longer pretend wasn't there. Without anyone to rely on, the smallest errands became exhausting. She had no one to turn to. Her children had pulled away, calling less and less until their voices vanished completely from her life. The loneliness gnawed at her, a constant reminder of what she'd given up. She had tried to reach out, of course. She tried to call Leon, leaving pleading messages on his phone. "Leon, it's Mom. Please, I just want to hear from you. I know I messed up, but can't we talk? I miss you. I love you." But he never returned her calls. In a last-ditch attempt, she even wrote a letter to James, asking for his forgiveness, but it went unanswered. One night, the weight of her decisions grew too heavy, and Destiny found herself crying, the sound echoing in her empty apartment. She clutched her phone, scrolling through old family photos. She saw snapshots of birthdays, vacations, silly moments she'd captured without a thought. Each photo was a reminder of the life she'd chosen to destroy, and each face, James's, the children's, even her own, felt like strangers. The phone suddenly buzzed, jarring her from her thoughts. For a brief, hopeful moment, she thought it might be one of the kids. But when she checked the screen, it was a bill reminder, a late fee on her medical expenses. She hadn't been able to keep up with payments, and the bills kept piling up. Her health had deteriorated over the past year, and the absence of family support weighed on her more than ever. One morning, she went to the park, hoping to find some solace among the greenery. She watched families enjoying picnics, children running around with carefree smiles, mothers and fathers laughing together. An elderly woman approached her and took the bench beside her. They exchanged a polite smile, and after a few minutes, the woman glanced over, seeming to sense the sadness lingering around Destiny. "Are you all right, dear?" the woman asked gently. Destiny forced a smile, just thinking about how things used to be. The woman nodded, her gaze soft with understanding. Memories have a way of haunting us, don't they? But sometimes we have to make peace with the past, even if it's painful. Destiny looked down, ashamed. I think it's too late for me. The woman shook her head. It's never too late to make peace, even if you can't fix everything. Sometimes, peace is about accepting where you are, even if it's not where you want to be. The woman's words lingered with Destiny long after she left the park. That night, as she lay in bed, she wondered if she'd ever truly find peace. She knew she couldn't change what she'd done. The lies, the betrayal, they had all come full circle, leaving her with nothing but regret. Months passed and Destiny's health continued to decline. She spent more days in and out of the hospital, each visit draining her savings. Her once vibrant life was reduced to routine checkups and empty hours. She still reached out to her children now and then, though by now, she had given up on expecting a response. She wrote letters that went unsent, filled with apologies and promises she knew she couldn't keep. It was a desperate attempt to release the guilt, but she remained trapped in the web she'd woven for herself. One afternoon, while going through an old box of keepsakes, she found a crumpled, faded birthday card from James. It was from years ago, back when things were still good between them. She opened it, and the familiar handwriting brought tears to her eyes. To my one and only my partner, my best friend. I love you more than words can say. Here's to many more years together. Forever yours, James. The words stabbed at her heart, a reminder of the love she had carelessly tossed aside. She clutched the card to her chest, tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered into the silence. I'm sorry, James. I'm so sorry. Years later, James, now remarried to Dorothy and surrounded by his children and grandchildren, was living the life he had always dreamed of. His home was filled with warmth, laughter, and the kind of love that had once been tainted but had since found healing. His past had shaped him, but it no longer defined him. Every so often, he would think of Destiny, wondering what had become of her, but he didn't dwell on it. He had made peace with his past, forgiving himself for the pain he had endured. The family he had built with Dorothy and the strong bonds he had with his children were testaments to his resilience. One day, as he sat in his living room with his family gathered around, he felt a deep, abiding sense of gratitude. He had come through the fire stronger, his heart open to new love and honest relationships. He glanced at Dorothy, who smiled back at him with the kind of understanding only she could offer. They had both faced hardships, but together, they had found a way forward. In that moment, James knew that, no matter what lay in his past, he had finally found peace and happiness in his new life, a life built on trust, love, and second chances. The shadows of betrayal and regret had faded, leaving only the bright light of a future he was grateful to embrace.